Entrepreneurial Thinking's Top 10 Podcast of 2019, next on City Corner. Hi, I'm Sarah Thompson, and welcome to City Corner. The award-winning podcast, Entrepreneurial Thinking, recently celebrated its 150th episode. And so we thought, to close out 2019, what better idea could we do than to talk about the top 10 podcast of 2019? I'm joined today by the co-host of Entrepreneurial Thinking and the founder of the podcast, Christy Maxfield. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You were just here not that long ago.
Well, I think two's better than one, right? More the merrier.
And well, I think what's really great is here we are at the end of 2019. You're celebrating your 150th podcast, which
Very
is
excited
episode.
about that.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. And I think it would just be great to kind of talk about what your top picks were for the year.
Sure. Our listeners really tell us what our top shows are. So we looked at the top 10 based on plays and downloads, which is how we know who's listening to what. Mm-hmm. And we had an eclectic group of people this year. Quentin Ortega actually leads the pack there. His was the most played and download show. And he, if you don't know him, does a lot of work in our ecosystem, particularly with I-10, where he's an entrepreneur in residence, and with the Square One program at the Center for Emerging Technologies, where he's one of the track leaders of the startup program that we do there.
So we've got, and we've lined up sort of the
there
slides.
We go. There's Quentin.
There is, and I want to go through them, but before we get started, just for anyone who is watching this and they're not familiar, they heard me say entrepreneurial thinking, so they know that this has got to be about entrepreneurs. But tell us a bit about the podcast and how it all started, because you have decades of experience doing so much work in St. Louis, but you're not just the podcast host.
I'm not just the podcast, but we do a lot of podcasts. We're releasing one new show a week. We actually started 3 years ago, hence the ability to have our 150th this year. And I co-host the show with Dr. Cheryl Watkins-Moore. She leads the STEM Inclusion Initiative for BioSTL. Cheryl and I met when I was on staff at the Center for Emerging Technologies. I'm now there as a program consultant. And we collaborate. We're looking at how can we encourage more and more individuals, particularly women and entrepreneurs of color, to become part of the entrepreneurship ecosystem in whatever way, shape, or form. And thinking really broadly about what that might look like. And so as collaborators, Cheryl really focused on raising awareness. And in my role at CET, how can we then provide them with the support and training they need to take that idea and validate whether or not it's going to be a successful business? That's what we do with the Square One program. So Jade Harrell, who is actually a graduate of the Square One program, came to us one day and said, you guys need to do a podcast. And we said no. No, absolutely not. We're funny in our own minds.
Idea.
We enjoy each other's company tremendously, but no, that's not going to happen. And 150 shows later, she was right, we were wrong. And we really said yes, ultimately, because we thought how better to reach a wide variety of people, particularly people who don't opt in necessarily to programs that are place-based. So if you have a program that's at, say, Cortex or one of the buildings within Cortex, like the Center for Emerging Technologies, if you don't self-identify as an entrepreneur yet, if you're not doing your business full-time maybe, you may say, oh, that's not for me, right? That's not where, or bioscience, I'm not a bioscience entrepreneur, that's not for me. And so the podcast lets us say, yes, this is for you. In fact, don't take our word for it. Listen to the people we interviewed, because they're going to tell you how they decided to get into whatever business they're working on, whether it's full-time, part-time, whether they're making the transition from working for someone to working for themselves, whether they're solo entrepreneurs or they have employees. It comes in all different shapes and sizes. And so what we find is the podcast is a great way to inspire others to pursue what they're interested in.
And I love that it is such a diverse group of people that you interview for the podcast firm. I saw the one for somebody who started a flower truck to, as you were talking about something that's more tech related. And then when I was reading some material, I thought it was interesting. You were saying that the great thing about the podcast is that every episode, it's really evergreen. It's something that you can come back to.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's part of the sort of formula of why it's so popular?
For for sure. I mean, podcasts in general, it's appointment listening, right? I make the appointment with myself to listen to whatever it is that's interesting to me at the time that's most convenient for me, unlike broadcast media, right? And then I can just, within that type of format, then pick and choose. I don't have to listen to every show. I could go on our website and use our search word function and find topics that are of interest to me. I could skip around different seasons. And as I get to know the show more and am more interested, I might even start listening to things that I didn't necessarily think were of interest to me, but really are. And that's what I love about it, is it means that for the people featured, they could be sharing this content a year or two after they've been on the show, because our goal is to make sure they were talking about their story. And that's their story. They get to tell it in their own words as often as they'd like. And our listeners, who are whether new to the show or new to that podcast episode, get to rediscover something on their own timetable, which means you could listen tomorrow to something that I listened to 6 months ago, and we can both get what we need from it.
That's great. So now now we can start.
All right, we're diving into the top 10.
Let's dive into the top 10. So let's go back. We'll start with the one we already started with, Quentins. So what makes Quentins so interesting to be on this top 10 list? And I should clarify too, we're not saying like the best. We're just saying what you sort of felt were really poignant.
This is literally how many plays and downloads, because I can't choose my top. If Cheryl and I had sat down and went, no, out of the 50 some odd, close to 52 brand new shows we did this year, what are your top favorites? We'd probably still be debating it, right? So I went right to the people. I went right to the people, and the people said, based on plays and downloads, these are the top ones. And I think what Quentin's story resonates with is a few things. One, he's a UMR grad, S&T grad, depending on which era of the university you're familiar with. He was an entrepreneur in college and continued that trajectory afterwards. He works with I-10 and with Square One and the CET program. And he's actively involved in entrepreneurship on a day-to-day basis, owning and as well as being part of other businesses. And so he's also from a really small town in Missouri. And when he was featured, he got some real great hometown play. They were really proud of their favorite son. So Quentin's story, I think, resonated with a lot of people and reached a lot of people who said, you know what, I'm from that place too, right? And so it's interesting to see what his trajectory is. And
so what was he saying ultimately at the kind of the
I think honestly with Quentin, he sees so many different kinds of companies, and he's been really integral in the business model validation part of the work that goes into, will somebody buy what you're selling?
I see.
Because we can all have a lot of great ideas, but the business model validation process says there's actually some there. And that's really what he specializes in. So being able to talk from his own personal experience, I think really hit a chord for folks.
And then we get into, I think the one that I have next in order is Hysteric Maze and John Payne. I think this is the next one. So tell me about, so we had to include a cannabis discussion in here,
again, our listeners included a cannabis discussion. Cheryl actually happens to be partners with Derek, and they are part of the leadership team for what will be one of Missouri's only minority-owned medical cannabis companies moving forward. So we're waiting on the licenses right now from the state of Missouri, and that's intriguing because you very rarely get to see an industry grow from the ground up, and that's what our listeners get a window into. Is these are professionals who did everything they were supposed to do, got the good education, got the full-time job, are making good money, having a successful career. And they're actually exploring this brand new industry and what it would mean to go into that. So
and that's really
exciting.
It is exciting, and I think what's great about that too is I know I've been seeing some articles that are actually sort of talking about the sort of lockout of diversity owners in the cannabis industry. So it's really great to see that.
Having a Black-owned medical cannabis company in Missouri is particularly important because many people who were adversely affected by the prior laws will not get to reap the benefits of the current deregulation. So it's important that they be represented in the upside of this industry as well.
No, that's a good one. That's interesting. And then we move on to, I think I've got this in the right order, is this Tiny Little Monster, Sloan Coleman?
Yes. So if for those of you who don't know, St. Louis has a rich culture of printmaking, and we have a number of apparel companies that are homegrown, and Tiny Little Monster is one of them. One of our recently released shows is going to inch into the top 10 very quickly. STL
You're
Style.
Right. We're not done with 2019 yet, right?
STL Style is hot on their heels, so we might actually have two t-shirt companies, two print companies in the top 10 by the end of the year. And what I love about Tiny Little Monsters, they really started small in their basement doing screen printed T-shirts.
Wow.
And now they have a building. They've got at least a dozen employees. They're 6 years in, and they're looking at how can we grow from here.
Wow.
In their words, they hit all their 10-year goals in less than 10 years, and now, so what's next, right?
Wow.
And they're the quintessential small business, right? Everybody needs a T-shirt. You can choose whether or not to source that locally or not, and when you source locally, you can have the option to work with somebody who's living, sleeping, eating, breathing the business, right?
Wow.
And employing people in our community, which is particularly inspiring.
And do you feel like in the interviews, are you ultimately, by the end of the interview, coming up with this sort of inspirational sort of talking point that everyone knows through these business owners what to do next or what they took away with? I mean, do you feel like the interviews kind of ultimately come out with some sort of kernel of knowledge at the end of it?
Absolutely. So Cheryl makes sure that we start at the beginning. So she always asks, where are you from? And what is your origin story? Sort of, how did you get to where you are today? So really being able to see that people come from all different backgrounds before they choose to embark on entrepreneurship. And then somewhere along the way, someone shares with us how they got into this, what kind of planning they did, who their advisors are, how they're really making the business into a going concern. And there's always a tidbit we can stop. And often we will stop them. We'll say that again for our listeners.
Right.
It's something that we think is really particularly important, usually around planning, talking to your customer base, being prepared to make changes and pivots to your business model. Because these are the things that, regardless of your business type, you're going to encounter as a business owner. And then, frankly, we ask them just, what's hard about this?
Yes.
What do you struggle with?
Yeah.
What are your challenges? And for them to say, I'm scared. I wake up worried about this. It was really hard to go here and do these things. I'm really trying to figure out the next step with. Really demystifies whatever we see from the outside looking in, which usually looks really good.
Right. Because we're always used to sort of publicizing the success stories.
Of course we do, right?
But then we never really ask, what is the day-to-day? I mean, do you just want to give up on some days?
Yeah, and some days are really hard. And we know that a significant number of our listeners actually listen on their desktops, which tells us that they are listening while they work.
Yeah.
And they're listening for that inspiration. They're listening for that, oh, wow, they're not that different from me. And I could do this too. And, I have a role model now.
Yeah. No, I think it's great, and I want to pick back up because I know we've got our few more.
I know we've got a few more
for our top 10, but we are going to take a quick break. Before we do, if you are interested in listening to the podcast, you can head to their website, entrepreneurialthinking.com, and then, as Christy's been talking about, you can actually subscribe on iTunes, iHeart, Spotify. It's all there, Google Podcasts, so that you can, frankly, even though people are listening to it at work, you can listen to it on your own time at home as well. And be sure to follow them on social media. We've got it right there: Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But we've got more to go in our top 10 list, so we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Entrepreneurial Thinking. Stay with us.
Garden is loved by green thumbs and non-gardening types alike because you can play. You can relax. And there's always something new to experience, no matter the time of day or the season. And learn about conservation and one-of-a-kind plants. So come and experience St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Sarah Thompson, and welcome back to City Corner. Today, we are focusing on the award-winning podcast, Entrepreneurial Thinking. The podcast just celebrated its 150th episode, and so I'm joined by the co-host, Christy Maxfield, and founder of the podcast. And your other co-host couldn't be here.
She is busy doing entrepreneurial things, actually.
And so we're back on this theme of, as we close out 2019, looking at some of your top 10 podcasts. And I want to pick right back up. So I think where we left off, we're next on Jonathan Allen. Tell me a bit about Jonathan.
EQSTL, so the Entrepreneurship Quarterly digital magazine for our sector. And Jonathan's actually originally from the UK and did a startup in New York before moving to St. Louis. So he's got a lot to contribute, both as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's highlighting their work like we are.
And it's great to see with EQ. I remember when that started, and just to see its growth and how much it's done.
Absolutely.
It's really neat.
Yeah, and Jonathan, like us, knows that there are tons of entrepreneur stories that go untold. Lots of folks who are underpublicized. And they're not doing big and splashy companies, but they're building really solid businesses. And so elevating and celebrating those stories, we share a lot in common that way too.
No, that's great. No, I'm glad that's included in here. And then we go to, and I think this is in the right order, Sherita Love.
Sherita is your quintessential social entrepreneur. So if you don't know what that means, it means that she's mixing the ability to do good by doing good business, right? And creating a business model where, in her case, transforming education. So through EdHub, which is run out of the Venture Cafe in the Cortex district.
Oh, okay.
So Sherita's on talking about the EdHub model and what that means and how it's going to transform education.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So how do you, when you're, I'm going to get on to continue with our list, but how are you hearing about, I mean, you're clearly tapped in. So first, let's acknowledge that. But I mean, how are you hearing about such an interesting and wide group of people, and then to decide who gets, who you're going to be able to interview?
Yeah, one of the things is, if you're committed to telling the stories of people who are underrepresented, then you have to actually make a point of going out and doing business with them, right? And so whether it's being on mailing lists and following people on social media, as well as cultivating your extended network, right? Putting a lot of time into getting to know people and then showing up where they are and building the relationship organically. We're at the point in the podcast too where people are starting to know about us.
Yeah.
And so we do get some people who reach out and say, this is my story and I'd love to be part of the show. But I would say most of it is that we're reading some of the publications that everybody else is, but then we're also very intentionally networking in the communities where we want to find the entrepreneurs' stories who we are focused on telling. So we're going to those workshops, we're seeking out those pop-ups, we're going to those farmers markets, we're actually meeting the entrepreneurs where they are.
And you're doing the legwork.
We're doing the legwork, and we tell everybody the way you build is to be authentic, right? It's whether it's building your business, building your brand, building your outreach, serving populations, you do that by being very intentional with who you are interacting with, how you're interacting with them, and showing up where they are, and not always expecting folks to come to you.
No, I think that's great. Well, let's pick back up. I thought this was so neat. Butter Love, the business Butter
Love. So I have to say, full disclosure, it is Cheryl's husband's favorite brand of all the ones that we've interviewed. So if he had a top 10 list, she would be number one.
Got it.
So she does handmade, naturally sourced body butters and other body products. So La Gracia Wilderness does an amazing line of products. And she's one of many folks who fall into that food, fashion, beauty category, where the technical term would be consumer goods. But really in our community, what that boils down to is people who are making hair and facial products, skin products, people who are making clothing and designing with textiles. People who are putting good food on the table for others, either as caterers, as restaurateurs, or as packaged goods, actually selling stuff in supermarkets and grocery stores. So,
and she makes her products here.
She makes her products here, and she sells them. You can find them at a lot of different local stores. I think Max Local Buys is one of the places you can get that, probably also at Union Studio. I'm trying to think of a few places I've seen her, but I know you'll have to beat Cheryl's husband because he tends to clean her out. He loves her body butters.
Oh, that's great. And I'm sure, and with the interview that you did, like her process and starting that business, that's great. Then we've got Melissa Douglas, and I hope this is the next one we have in order. Yes. So goal-driven counseling.
Yeah, so Melissa does this amazing thing where, as you may know, being able to find counselors, mental health professionals who are also people of color can be very challenging. There's just not as many of them, and because of licensure, you can only practice within state lines, right? So one of the ways Melissa's addressed that dearth of professionals is by having an online virtual counseling model, which allows her to serve people regardless of where they are in Missouri. And in the case of international clients who aren't in a contiguous state, she can also serve beyond boundaries. So what we loved about her was, as a counselor, she's creating a business model that works for her and her family, gives her flexibility, and allows her to grow her business in a way that isn't tied geographically to having a single office where people have to come for a point of service, which means she is also able to make her resources available to more and more people in a world where we need that. We need that service available.
That's great. I have heard of this, like more and more, but I did not realize. I mean, this is great that someone right here in St. Louis was doing, but I've heard of this through some friends of mine who work in the mental health field. But really, that's interesting. That's great. I'm going to ask to get the next one up because I'm not sure if it's definitely connected in order. Here we
Keisha.
go. Keisha. So tell me about Keisha, the art of networking.
Speaks, yes. So Keisha's actually, if you've heard her speak, you'll know that she is dynamic, to say the least. And her personal journey has been from full-time employee and part-time speaker to full-time speaker. And now I believe she's on staff again with a larger company. But the ability to understand what your superpower is, in her case, it's how to network and connect with people, and then really build a brand around that and being able to look at what is the service she can provide for the community. Because at the heart of the matter for all entrepreneurs is, what problem are you solving and for whom are you solving it? And if you know what problem you're solving, then you can figure out who needs that problem solved and how best to go about it. And that's the heart of the business model validation process. So.
Yeah, and networking is so important. I know some people are just natural talents at it,
and other people need a lot of help, and
that's
okay.
So here's our next one. You're going to have to help me with this one. Is this Justin?
This is Justin Barr and STL Above. So Justin started out as a photographer, and then actually drone photography became his specialty. And Justin, like about 2/3 of the people we interview, does not self-identify as an entrepreneur, if I remember correctly from that episode. But has been doing this on the side, really, so to speak, and yet has had his photos credited, the Blues and the Cardinals, and he had special permission to fly near the Arch, which was quite difficult to get. But he takes these amazing aerial photographs, and so to hear him talk about how his business has evolved, how his vision of himself in doing this work has evolved, and the ability to attract people to the work because he's able to produce an amazing product.
And I think you've brought up a couple times this really good point though of how people, I meet people all the time who say I'm an entrepreneur, and then there's people who are absolutely entrepreneurs, but they just can't come to think of themselves that way, even though
they may identify as a small business owner, or they're working for themselves, having their side gig, whatever the case may be. Entrepreneur has a lot of connotations wrapped around it, right? We tend to think of venture capital, we tend to think of Silicon Valley, we tend to think of people who don't look a lot like you or me. And that can be very intimidating, right? And so we could be doing entrepreneurial things, and we can even be in a full-time job and be thinking entrepreneurially and bringing that to our workplace and not necessarily self-identify as entrepreneurs. And so that's part of the conversation, is to say, clearly these folks are doing things that are entrepreneurial, and yet that word isn't accessible to everybody. And so let's talk about what it means or what it could mean. Maybe you call yourself a maker or a creator. Maybe you're an inventor. All those words are different ways of talking about creating value in the world. And then in the case of building a business around it, actually being able to monetize that value.
That's great. That's great. I think we have one last one, our final one for our top 10. Let's take a look at this one. And here we go. So this
Ronki Felsi. Designer handbags, one of many. Actually, there were at least 3 this season alone. Ronki, the Lux and Nix brand, and the Save the Girls brand, all different companies within the bi-state area that have manufactured different types of purses and handbags to meet the needs of busy women. Ronki uses the word womaning, right? When we're busy womaning, we need a lot of different things at our disposal, and we need accessories that are going to work with our lifestyles. And so where we can raise families and build businesses, be out on the road and do the things we need to do. So she's created some incredible products as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And was she a designer before? Is this one of those
No,
career
this is actually, she's, as far as I know, she is still full-time at her 9 to 5 while
Really?
running this on the side. Yeah, so a lot of times entrepreneurs identify a need in their own life and then extrapolate, do the market research and figure out, oh, this wasn't just my problem. There are a lot of people for whom this is a problem. My solution might need to be tweaked this way or that way, because very rarely does the customer want it exactly the way we think they want it. But they go out and they talk to other people and they realize that there's something universal in what they're trying to do for themselves, and then they can create a product that works really well for a whole great number of people, and build a business in that way. And that's what each of, in this case for designer handbags, what they've been able to do. And we've got a wide swath of folks on the show. There's more than 52 shows to choose from just from this episode, just from this year alone, running the gamut from food and beverages and skin and body products to consumer goods and everything in between, mental health services, and a variety of different topics. Yeah.
And so here you are. I mean, you've done 150 episodes.
Yes.
Obviously, January is just around the corner, and
Yes.
so you're going to have a whole lineup for the next season. I mean, when you're doing this interview after interview after interview, and if someone said to you, you had to write, like, if there's two or one or commonality that everyone seems to have, what would you say it is? Because it really is an inspiration to hear that people are just doing it, and that really does say a lot. But what would you say is like the one thing that you're just reassured of, or you learn after every time you finish up these interviews?
Well, what I'm always reminded of is the fact that we are not alone in our desire to create things in the world, but we may not be connected to the people who think that same way, because we get taught, go get the good job, build a life and a career for you and your family, and we're seeking stability and continuity. And entrepreneurship is perceived as being very, very risky, and a direct opposition to that. And so what I'm always reminded of is that it's important to tell these stories because we need to connect people who are like-minded to each other and let them know and feed off of the energy of what it is to step out and take that risk. So that's really exciting. And then fundamentally, the folks who are successful are the folks who've taken the time to create the plan, to run their numbers, to talk to their customers, and to make the changes to their business model that they need to in order to be successful. Those commonalities really seem to run the gamut regardless of the type of company you're building.
It's so neat. I mean, you're just really getting a chance to just highlight such talent in St. Louis and people who are doing it. And I know you are busy, so I appreciate you.
No, we
coming in
appreciate the
today.
chance to tell people about the show. We're nothing without our listeners, right?
True. And congratulations too on the
Thank you.
150th episode. And please share that with your team, and just
Absolutely,
congratulations. And thank you so much for being here. And if you want to tune into Entrepreneurial Thinking, we're going to put, before we close out the show, the information there for you on the screen. There it is. Just head to the website. It's great. You can listen on your desktop, as we talked about.
Or your devices, whatever you want.
Subscribe to iTunes. We've got it all there. iHeart, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and then, of course, you can follow on social media. But some really, really interesting guests and interviews. So check it out, entrepreneurialthinking.com. And thank you at home for watching, and keep it right here on STL TV Experience St. Louis.